Hi, everybody, and welcome back to this week's Q&A session for our Situ lectures. This week, we're lucky enough to speak with Professor Nicola Marples from Trinity College Dublin. As a reminder, I'm Sophia Wood. I'm the country manager for OPWAL's Ecuador programs and also work with Friends of Wallacea, our program to help OPWAL partners develop sustainable tourism operations to help them bring income towards their conservation goals. Today we'll chat a little bit with Nicola about island biogeography and her lecture, Principles of Island Biogeography, her studies of birds in Indonesia with OPWAL and otherwise. So if you have any questions that come up during our chat, you can send any questions via email to xsitu@opwal.com, even throughout the talk. You can also send them via our chat on YouTube. And if you're watching this via the OPWAL website or on Facebook and you can't see that chat, you can click on the YouTube button or you can go over to the email and it will open up in a separate tab where you can send your questions. So feel free to send us any questions that come up as we're chatting. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nicola.
You're very welcome.
It was a great lecture. I personally am a huge fan of island biogeography. So I'm very excited to chat about this topic. As we get started, I'd love to hear about kind of how you first got involved with OPWAL.
Well, it was a very interesting day because Tim Coles, who runs OPWAL, as you know, just turned up in my office. I'd never seen him before in my life. I had no idea who he was. He sat down in the chair opposite me and said, would you like to go to Indonesia? If so, you need to get 10 students to come with you, and then you can go for free. And up until then, I'd never been to a tropical country. I'd never been to a developing country. I've not been to anywhere like that at all before. And I didn't do biogeography. So it was kind of a bit of a bolt out of the blue, which I think is kind of an important point, that I've ended up doing quite a lot of a really fascinating subject. I did evolution before, but I'm really a behavioral ecologist.
Okay.
So it was a case of saying yes because it sounded interesting rather than because I thought I could do it. And that began 20 years of work in Indonesia.
Well, shows the importance of those little moments, and that sounds very on par with the Tim Coles that I know. So I'm glad you went to find you. Were you working at Trinity College at the time?
Yeah, I was okay. There. I hadn't been there all that long. A couple of years, but yes. So in Ireland.
Great. And before, so you said you weren't necessarily studying, excuse me, island biogeography before you started with OPWAL. So what was your research focus before you started working with OPWAL in Indonesia?
I was looking at bird food choice and how they expand their diets and what they do when they meet novel food. So really fussy eating in birds more than anything else. I was also at the time working on zoo animals a little bit. Okay. But that was, I mean, it was nothing to do with biogeography, but it was to do with evolution. I was interested in how the birds were evolving and the insects were evolving in response to the birds.
Right. And so did your passion for island biogeography, did that come out of your work in Indonesia, or was something else the inspiration there?
Yeah, and I mean, it's really interesting, and it's really just looking at evolution in practice. So, and I've always been really fascinated by evolution as a topic, and how animals change in response to each other and in response to where they end up. So just looking on islands and therefore being able to see evolution happening separately on the different islands is fantastic. So it's a really good way of getting to look at evolution in practice.
Right. I mean, obviously the changes you see across these different islands are happening much faster than we might be able to see on some big landmass.
They may not be happening faster, they're just more visible because you can see the mainland population is how it used to be, and the island population is what it's like now for that little subpopulation. So you can see speciation happening, it's the forming of new species happening in front of you. But it is still happening really slowly. It's taking 1 million years or so, but
Right.
you can see the stages of it happening. And it does happen a little bit faster on islands because the smaller the population, the faster evolution goes. So it is happening a bit faster, but it's the fact that you can compare the old version with the new version all the time that makes it so cool.
Yes, very cool. You mentioned in your talk, and a lot of your talk was obviously about bird populations since they're quite mobile. You mentioned that large mammals need to arrive in bigger numbers to these islands to become viable populations. So how many mammals would you need to start one of these populations? And are there any big mammals that have arrived and drifted far from their mainland species so they can be classed as a totally new species in Indonesia?
Yeah,
or where?
it's not really that they have to arrive in bigger numbers. It's just that mammals, particularly big mammals, tend to be in smaller numbers and therefore more likely to go extinct. So everybody's arriving kind of at the same, well, not arriving at the same rate because birds can fly there more easily and insects can get blown there more easily. So it's kind of hard for the mammals to get there in the first place. But if you think about it, let's imagine on Indonesia, we might have a civet that eats, I don't know, a rat, and a rat that eats, let's say, frogs. Then you're going to have one civet, and he in his life has to eat many hundred rats, and the rats, in order to stay alive, each one of them has to eat several hundred frogs. So you're going to end up with only one civet and many hundred frogs in your population on the island. So that one civet, if it's hit by a falling tree or it's den floods or whatever, it can go extinct really easily. Whereas the frogs are not going to go extinct because even if a load of them get hit by the falling tree, the others are still there to keep going. So the big mammals tend to be very rare on islands because of the fact that they have to be in small numbers, just because that's how ecology works. And because they're in small numbers, they go extinct more often.
That makes sense. So I guess that comes to the question of kind of, then what can the vulnerability of these island species tell us about conservation and how species survive over our increasingly fragmented conservation areas?
Well, they're kind of the ultimate natural experiment. So, I mean, all those little islands are effectively like little nature reserves, and we can look at what happens, how over time the fragmentation makes evolution different. And there are really two things going on there. The big things, as we just said, the big things tend to go extinct. So fragmenting your habitat is really bad for keeping the big things going. But it's actually really good for diversity because each of those little islands is different. So if it's something small like insects that you're trying to conserve, then you're going to end up with specialists on each of those different islands, which are different from each other. So you end up with much more diversity of the small things. So it's actually not a simple thing. Saying dividing up your nature reserve is bad is not actually how it is. Islands are a really hugely diverse collection of have a really hugely diverse collection of birds, for instance. But really, a lot of biodiversity is there. But if what you want to conserve is something big like a wolf, then don't divide up your nature reserve. So it lets you look at the interaction of those two processes, the one making more diversity and the other killing off big things.
Very interesting. So is it fair then to model these fragmented conservation areas kind of like islands?
Well, yeah, it is. It's the same idea. But it's just that you shouldn't look at it as simplistically saying, oh, well, if we divide up our nature reserve, we're going to get lower diversity. You might actually get higher diversity, but different things. And it depends what you're trying to do. So it's really very interesting looking at islands as a model for that.
Perfect. And so I guess you kind of answered this question, but it's one of the main ones we got in is why are there so many endangered endemic birds on these Indonesian islands, and what do you think is the best method for conserving them?
Yeah, so the answer is that there are so many islands and they're all different.
Right.
and that's going to give you lots of little little populations of different birds. So you're going to end up with birds specializing for each of those islands, which means that they're endemic. They're only going to exist on that island or places they're going to evolve initially on those islands.
Sure.
But they're also going to be low populations because they only exist on that one island. And that makes their population already endangered just from initially, kind of naturally endangered, if you like. But then people have come to all of those islands and lived on them and cut down the trees and changed the habitat. And that also endangers some more of those species that have evolved there in the first place. So it's all quite difficult to maintain populations because they're intrinsically small. But how do you do it? And what's the best hope? Well, the only hope is for buy-in by the locals, and there is absolutely no possibility of doing conservation unless everybody in the area is singing from that same hymn sheet. And in order for them to do that, it really has to be a case that it's more worth their while to look after those species than to cut down the trees and use those resources. So, or use them for anything else. Right. So it's a case of local buy-in is the only way of doing this. And to get that buy-in, you can't just say, well, they should. You have to actually make it so that it's profitable for them to do that.
Well, completely agree with that point. That's certainly one of the major reasons why we started Friends of Wallacea, to work with these communities and make sure there's a monetary incentive for communities to take care of their forest and be able to. Are there any conservation programs that you're currently working with in Indonesia or elsewhere that are doing that kind of work?
No, well, we've finished working in Indonesia now, because basically from health problems between myself and my husband, both shouldn't go back there anymore. And we also came to the end of kind of a set of research, so we stopped at that point.
So no future plans for continuing research in Indonesia?
Not directly, but though we have got some contacts out there who one that we're trying to get a PhD funding for, so that he can carry on doing research and sending us data and samples which he'll use for his PhD, and also we'll use to further research.
Perfect. Well, maybe we'll be expecting you at other Opwall sites then. So I like this question. This is quite a fun one. Which was your favorite island of the 13 that were included in the study, and why?
That's really hard. And we went to more than that 13 as well. So I think probably the most remote is my favorite, which is called Runduma. And I think it's my favorite because, for a start, we almost didn't get there. It's really hard to get to. So in order to get there, we had to stay on this appallingly rickety fishing ship that agreed to take us out there, despite the fact that the storms that were supposed to blow up might have come, and God alone knows what would have happened if that had happened. But so I just remember lying above the fish hold, looking out at the horizon. So this is a wooden ship with nothing on the side, so it's just like a platform with a roof, and lying there looking at the sun coming up. And the guy who had navigated us there over this ocean all night he was navigating entirely by the stars. He had nothing at all, no electronics with him whatsoever. And as the sun came up, you could see Runduma as a little dot in the distance, and he was heading straight for it. He got it exactly right. So and when we were there, there's very few people there. There's one village on the whole island, and after work every day, so we go off and we put up our nets and catch birds, and then come back to the village. And after work every day, we could go and just go down their beach and swim on the coral reef till lunchtime, basically. So it was fantastic. It was really a lovely place. and they were really friendly. But everyone in Indonesia is incredibly friendly, so they were just typically really friendly. So that doesn't separate the islands because they were all lovely to us. But it was just an incredible place to be, and so far from anyone else.
Right. And were there any particular species of birds there that were really unique or endemic to specifically that island?
Not really, because as you get further away, more and more remote on these little tiny islands, then you get fewer and fewer species.
Of course.
Because they haven't got there. So it tends to be the big islands. So the other reason why it's hard to tell which is my favorite, I really like Bhutan as well, which is almost the mainland island, because you get macaques there, and you get these things called couscous, which are like a huge, it's a mammal, a couscous. It's like a big bear type sloth that's wandering around in the trees really slowly, and they're fantastic. So I really like being on the mainland because of the diversity of things that you get that you just don't get on the island.
Sure. That makes sense. That island, Roduma, you said?
Runduma.
Yeah, it sounds familiar. Is it one of the ones that Alfred Russel Wallace was studying in that area?
Oh, I've no idea. He went all over the place. I don't remember him mentioning that in any of the writings, but Runduma in any of the writings. But and it is pretty damn remote. It's tiny, so it depends. I mean, he could easily have got there because in those days they just sailed everywhere.
Sure.
But yeah, and he did some amazing stuff, and really he's under appreciated, Alfred Russel Wallace. He really should be as famous as Darwin, because he had all the same ideas. He understood everything about it. He kind of didn't work as hard at it. He apparently was sick with malaria, and it just came to him how natural selection must happen, and that has to be how evolution is working, which is such a fantastic idea. And he did tell Darwin that he thought of that as well. Darwin had been working away on it for years and years, 11 years or something. And I kind of, you end up thinking Darwin deserved it because he worked so hard, and Wallace deserved the accolade because he just saw it by being brilliant. So it's hard to know who deserves the accolade more. But yeah,
certainly Darwin won it. So I think it's fair to say that Wallace is underappreciated.
Yeah, he is, and maybe just being brilliant is not as laudable as working hard. I don't know.
Well, certainly, obviously, in terms of research area, you seem to overlap with him quite a lot.
Yeah, a huge amount, and that's really nice. It's wonderful to realize. And there's there's been various people like Hartett and so on, Victorian naturalists who also went out there and looked carefully enough at the birds that they started actually classifying them. And one of the nice things is we were able to prove Hartett correct, because he said that the Wakatobi flowerpecker is a different species, and everyone then said no, it isn't, and we proved it is. So that's really nice to know, to kind of back him up.
Yes. Well, speaking of that, you mentioned in your talk a bunch, obviously, all this different speciation across the different islands, and how you can tell. How can you determine if a bird is a new species, a subspecies, or one of these hybrid species that is then mixed with one from the mainland?
That is the $1 million question. It really is. It's an absolute pig of a question, because and even Darwin said that I actually wrote this down so that I could say it to you. Darwin said, in determining whether a form can be ranked as a species or a variety, the opinion of naturalists having sound judgment and wide experience seems to be the only guide to follow. So in other words, you just ask a taxonomist, and if the taxonomists agree, then it is a species. Nowadays, we have what's called integrated taxonomy, and that means that you take not just does it look different, which is one of the ways that people have done it for hundreds of years, or are breeding, which is always an argument because you don't know who they're breeding with.
Right.
now they take, do they look different, and so is the plumage of a bird different? Is its behavior different? Is it bigger or smaller than the other part of the population that you're trying to separate? So you've got a population here, on one island, population on another island. You collect up all the differences between those two. So in as I say, plumage and morphology, which is the size and shape, and behavior, and at the moment not genetics, bizarrely, but genetics will come into it shortly. And you put them all together, all of the information together, in what's called the Tobias score. Oh, you're allowed to have song in there as well, so are they singing differently? Because of course they're choosing their mates by song, so song's more important than you might think it is. And you put it all together to form what's called the Tobias score, and that's because it's named after a guy called Tobias. And Tobias said if it scores 7 or higher, then it's a species, and if it's 7 or lower, if it's lower than 7, then it's probably not a species, it's only a subspecies. Which again is still asking a taxonomist to make a number up, because why is it 7 rather than 8 or 6? So we really haven't come all that far. We're much more sophisticated about what we put into the model now, but we're still just saying to the body of taxonomists, of people that are interested in classification, do you agree that these two are different enough? And they are still saying, yeah, we agree, or no, we don't. And that's what makes a species be defined as a species. So it's really not as cut and dried as you think you would like to think it is. But
yeah,
you make a case, basically. You make a case in a paper, and they agree with you or they don't.
Okay. And do blood tests play any part?
Not at the moment. I don't know actually whether you can have different blood groups, different biochemistry in a Tobias score. I don't think you can. And at the moment there is not a genetic element, but that will clearly have to come in at some point. I don't know why Tobias didn't put genetic differences in, but it was really a fight against the geneticists. So at the same time we're saying, if you look at this gene and the difference between this particular gene between your two groups is 1.3, then that counts as a species, and if it's 1.2, then it doesn't. And he was saying, no, we've got to bring more information into this. Just the genetics is not enough.
Right. Okay. Well,
so it's really not
like it's a pretty hard question to answer.
Yeah, it's really not. So I say it's the $1 million question, because people are always and constantly arguing about it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, it sounds kind of subjective, funnily enough, as much as science likes to be very objective.
Yeah, well, it's kind of objective in that you can't make up the score. You've got to give it, you've got to measure things, and but what the score should be that defines the difference between the species and the subspecies is still argued about, and so it should be. I think it will change with time, because it really, what you're talking about with a species is two populations that are not breeding with each other anymore, and all of this is about proving that they're not breeding with each other anymore to separate, and that's kind of a subtle difference, really.
I was going to ask that. So it sounds, if it's a new species, they're no longer interbreeding.
Yeah, absolutely. And but what if they only haven't been interbreeding for 100 years or so?
Yeah. Oh. Hi, welcome back. Sorry for our technical difficulties. We are back, and we're just about finishing up here. So I'm just going to ask Nicola a couple more questions about your work, and kind of helping other people start a career in biology and field research. So I'd love to hear kind of, first of all, how you first realized that academia was the path that you wanted to take, and then also kind of giving any tips to young people looking to start a career in conservation and research.
How did I get into it? I always knew it. Even when as a small child, I knew academia was for me, or I knew that what I wanted to be was a zoologist. And bizarrely, even age 5, I knew that what I wanted to be was a behavioral biologist. I wanted to look at healthy animals behaving in the wild. And I always knew that, which is really weird, but it is true. So how do people get into it? Do what you're interested in is absolutely my advice. Take up opportunities whenever they present, but don't think that you're driving this. You can't predict what's going to happen in your career. You have no idea what's going to happen next. So don't just go with that. Don't worry about it. So if an opportunity comes along, like Tim turning up in my office and saying, "Do you want to become a biogeographer?" Then at the time I thought, I can't do that. I don't know anything about it. But I didn't let that stop me saying, yes, let's take this opportunity and see where it takes me. And it's really important to do that. If you're interested by something, then go for it, and you will learn enough on your way. That's the learning stuff just means working hard and trying to. And if you're interested in it, that's not hard work. If you're bored by it, don't do it, because if you're not interested in it, then working hard at it is really hard work. So my advice is do the things that excite you.
That's great advice. Well, I think that's a great place to end on. And before we kind of close up, I just wanted to ask if there's any projects or social media or websites you want to shout out for people to follow or follow your work before we close up.
Well, look, I guess there's the EcoEvo blog in the zoology department of Trinity. So put EcoEvo Trinity Zoology into a search engine, you'll get there. That tends to be blogs written by our postgrads about everything that interests them. So tends to be a really good place to follow just little snippets of exciting stuff.
Great. Well, that seems like great advice. Thank you so much for your time today, Nicola. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and I hope you all enjoyed our question and answer session for this episode of Situ. See you next time.